In the heart of a blinding Wyoming blizzard, a luxury car comes to a stop. For a moment, it looks like salvation, until a young mother and her newborn babies are forced out into the deadly cold. But a crucial detail was missed by her cruel betrayer. The entire act was seen by a pair of watchful gray eyes, and that witness would lead an unsuspecting hero to deliver justice. Subscribe to our channel to follow this incredible story of survival and retribution. The wind screamed across the high plains of Wyoming, a physical force that stole breath and cut through cloth like a shard of ice. Naya felt its fury in her bones. Each step was a battle, her legs sinking deep into the blinding, endless snow. Tucked against her chest, beneath the thin blanket she had managed to save, were her twin babies, their tiny bodies a fragile warmth against her own failing heat. She was a young woman, with the high cheekbones and long dark hair of her Arapaho ancestors, but now her face was a mask of frozen tears and desperation. Her world had been reduced to the next agonizing step, the next ragged breath, and the singular burning need to protect the two lives she held. Just hours ago, there had been warmth. The memory flickered behind her eyes, as cruel as the wind itself. She remembered the heated leather of the passenger seat, the low hum of the engine, and the man beside her, Kalen Blackwood. He was a man from her own community who had risen high, his traditional roots buried beneath expensive wool coats and the cold gleam of ambition in his dark eyes. He had promised her a future, a life of security far from the hardships she knew. But that promise shattered the moment he saw the twin boys after their birth, their features a clear and undeniable link to a family line he despised. "They are a dead end," he had snarled, his voice stripped of all its earlier charm. Then the car door had opened, and he had pushed her out into the storm, the sight of his polished shoes turning away from her on the snow-covered road being the last thing she saw before the blizzard swallowed everything. Now, there was only the white fury. Her arms ached, her legs were numb, and the world was beginning to blur at the edges. The cold was no longer just a feeling, it was a weight, a heavy blanket pulling her down into a final, peaceful sleep. She stumbled, her knee hitting the snow with a dull finality she could no longer feel. "This is it," she thought, her body giving in. She curled herself around her babies, a last, futile act of protection. As her eyelids fluttered, a shape emerged from the swirling chaos. At first, she thought it was a wolf, large and powerful, its coat a striking blend of gray and white, like the winter sky itself. It moved with silent purpose, its head low, its intelligent eyes fixed on her. As it drew closer, she saw it was not a wild animal, but a magnificent German shepherd. It stopped a few feet away, a silent, gray ghost in the heart of the storm. The great dog let out a single, low bark that cut through the wind. A moment later, a figure emerged behind him, drawn from the swirling snow like a spirit of the mountain. It was a man, tall and lean, his broad shoulders covered by a worn sheepskin coat. He stopped, his eyes falling on the heap in the snow that was Naya and her children. This was Kenai. He was a man in his late 30s, his face hardened by a life lived outdoors and a pain he kept locked behind his gaze. His dark hair was pulled back from a face that bore the quiet intensity of a hunter, but his eyes held the haunted stillness of a soldier who had seen too much. For a heartbeat, he remained motionless, the solitude he had so carefully built around himself, warring with the scene of utter desperation before him. The dog, Seton, looked back at him, a silent plea in his intelligent eyes. The battle within Kenai ended. He moved forward, his steps sure and swift. He knelt, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he brushed the snow from Naya's face. He didn't speak, his actions doing all the talking. He gathered her into his arms as if she weighed nothing, his movements efficient and practiced. Seton circled them once, then bounded ahead, leading the way to a small cabin nearly swallowed by the drifts. The warmth inside was a shock, a wave of life that washed over Naya's frozen limbs. The cabin was sparse and impeccably clean. a fire roaring in a stone hearth. Kenai laid her on a cot near the flames before carefully taking the 2 small bundles from her and placing them beside her. As he worked, moving with a quiet focus to warm cloths and broth, Naya saw the shadows in his eyes. He handled her babies with a tenderness that seemed at odds with his rugged exterior, a gentleness born not of practice but of memory and loss. Just as a fragile sense of safety began to settle in Naya's heart, a new terror arose. One of the twins, the smaller of the 2, began to whimper, his cry thin and pained. She reached for him, her own hand trembling, and felt a burning heat radiating from his tiny body. A fever, fierce and sudden. She looked at Kenai, panic flaring in her eyes. The storm outside raged on, trapping them completely. He met her gaze, and in that shared moment of fear, his carefully constructed walls of isolation began to crack. The blizzard had brought them to his door, but a new fight for survival had just begun inside the quiet cabin. The fever broke with the dawn. In the quiet that followed, a fragile peace settled over the small cabin. For the first time in days, both of Naya's sons slept soundly, their tiny chests rising and falling in a steady, reassuring rhythm. She watched them, her heart a tangle of gratitude and lingering fear. Kenai sat across the room, sharpening a knife with slow, deliberate strokes, but she could feel his watchful gaze. The silence between them was no longer one of strangeness, but of shared experience. In that quiet, Naya found the courage to speak the rest of her story, her voice low but steady. She told him not just of the abandonment, but of the deeper poison Kaylin had spread. He had told people she had stolen from him, painting her as a thief to cover his own cruelty and ensure no one in their community would ever take her in. It was a betrayal designed not just to cast her out, but to erase her very honor. Kenai stopped his work, his knuckles white around the handle of the knife. He didn't offer empty words of comfort. He simply listened, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight and a flicker of something she hadn't seen before, a shared indignation. He looked from her tired, determined face to the sleeping children, and he saw a resilience that shamed his own retreat from the world. Throughout her story, the great German shepherd, Seton, had rested his head on her lap. The dog's unwavering trust was a bridge between the 2 broken people, a silent endorsement that went deeper than words. Seton's affection for her and the babies seemed to give Kenai permission to feel again, to let a crack of light into the fortress he had built around his heart. Just as a sliver of hope felt possible, a new sound intruded upon their sanctuary. It was a faint, high-pitched hum, unnatural and completely alien to the sounds of the forest. Kenai was on his feet in an instant, his body tense, the old instincts of a soldier flaring to life. He moved to the small window, Naya close behind him. There, against the vast gray sky, a small, dark object hovered over the tree line. It was a drone, its camera lens an unblinking mechanical eye. The blood drained from Naya's face. This was not a simple hunt with men and tracks. Kaylin was using his wealth and technology to scan the wilderness, a cold and calculated search that could not be fooled by snow or terrain. The cabin was no longer a shelter, it was a target. The drone vanished over the ridge, but its presence lingered like a poison in the air. The sanctuary was broken. "We can't stay," Kenai said, his voice low and urgent, the quiet recluse replaced by the decisive soldier he once was. "That thing will bring them right to us." He looked at Naya, his gaze steady. "There is a place my ancestors used, a cave high in the mountains. It is a sacred place, hard to find, a place they will not look." He saw the fear in her eyes, but also a glint of steel. She gave a single, determined nod, her trust in him absolute. They moved quickly, packing only what was essential: dried meat, blankets, and the precious babies, strapped securely to their chests. Leaving the fragile warmth of the cabin felt like stepping off a cliff, but staying meant certain capture. Their journey was a grueling trial against the wilderness. They followed game trails only Kenai knew, climbing higher into the unforgiving peaks of the Wind River Range. The air grew thin and bitingly cold. Every step was a monumental effort, but Naya pushed onward, her quiet resilience a silent match for Kenai's rugged endurance. As dusk began to bleed across the snow, a new sound reached them, a low, angry hum that vibrated through the frozen ground. Snowmobiles. Kenai pulled Naya and the children behind a massive granite boulder, his body shielding them. The sound grew louder, accompanied by the faint shouts of men carried on the wind. They were close, sweeping the area just below their hiding spot. Discovery felt inevitable. Naya held her breath, pressing her son's face into her shoulder, her heart pounding a deafening rhythm in her ears. In that moment of heart-stopping tension, Seton acted. Before Kenai could give a command, the German shepherd slipped from their hiding place. He didn't run towards the men, but in the opposite direction, down a steep, rocky ravine. He let out a series of loud, sharp barks that echoed through the mountains, a deliberate and defiant challenge. The sound of the snowmobiles faltered, then turned, the angry buzz of their engines now following the heroic dog. Kenai grabbed Naya's arm, his voice a harsh whisper. "Now. We go now." They scrambled away, the sounds of the hunt fading behind them, replaced by a new, aching fear. Seton had bought their freedom, but they did not know at what cost. They reached the cave as the first hint of dawn touched the mountain peaks. It was a deep, sheltered hollow, shielded from the wind, a place that felt ancient and safe. But their relief was hollow, poisoned by a gnawing fear for Seton. Just as Kenai was pulling a small military-style radio from his pack, a movement at the mouth of the cave made them freeze. A familiar gray and white shape limped into view. It was Seton, exhausted and bleeding slightly from a cut on his leg, but alive. Naya cried out, rushing to embrace the heroic dog who sank gratefully to the ground, his duty done. With his friend safe, Kenai got on the radio. His voice was calm and clear as he spoke to a man on the other end, a respected tribal elder named Mikasi. He explained everything, his words painting a stark picture of Kalen's crimes. Hours later, Kalen arrived. He did not come with the roar of snowmobiles, but on foot, confident he had finally cornered his prey. He stepped into the clearing before the cave, a smug smile on his face, only to find it vanish. Waiting for him was not a frightened woman and a lone veteran, but Elder Mikasi and 4 stern members of the tribal council. Mikasi, a man whose quiet presence held more authority than any weapon, simply nodded toward Naya. This was her moment. She stepped forward, her children held by a now calm Kenai. With extraordinary courage, she faced the man who had tried to destroy her. She spoke not with rage, but with the unshakable power of the truth, her story laying his lies bare before the leaders of their people. Kalen stood speechless as tribal justice, swift and absolute, fell upon him. He was stripped of his standing and led away, his wealth and power turning to dust in the sacred mountain air. 1 year later, a small house stood near the edge of the community, nestled where the plains met the foothills. Laughter, small and bright, echoed in the warm sun as 2 toddlers chased a butterfly. Naya watched them, her face full of a peace she once thought impossible. Kenai worked nearby, carving a wooden horse, the haunted look in his eyes long since replaced by a quiet contentment. And sleeping in a patch of sunlight, ever watchful, lay Seton. The great German shepherd who had faced the storm was now a guardian of the family he had saved, a living symbol of the fierce and gentle love that had brought them all home. This story shows us that true saviors often appear when all hope seems lost. They come not with grand announcements, but with the quiet loyalty of a dog's gaze and the gentle hand of a stranger who chooses to care. If you believe in the power of such unexpected kindness, help us spread that message by sharing their story. Let us know in the comments which moment of courage resonated with you the most. And please subscribe to Tales of Rescue so we can continue bringing you stories that lift the spirit.